happy place. So I spent most of my teenage years plotting how I was going to move back to Sudan. I wanted to nestle back into our multi-generational home that my grandparents built in the 60s. This was a time when Sudan was a lot freer, it was more vibrant, and it was more peaceful. I loved my grandparents, and I loved that house in ways that I couldn't describe. I adore Sudan. I looked forward to the day where the summers I spent as a kid could be my everyday joys of living there. It was the really small things like the sounds of the birds chirping in the morning, having tea in the garden, the palm trees swaying, even the milkman who's known my sisters longer than I have, the man selling corn on our street corner, and all the familiar faces in the pharmacies, the supermarkets, the flower shops, even the man who tended our local graveyard. If all else crashed and burned, I knew I had Sudan, and that gave me an immense sense of peace. So in 2015, I graduated, and the following year, my grandmother passed away. So I went to Sudan to be with my family, and I just never came back. I found a job at a company who was pioneered by one of the most wonderful business people in Sudan. His name was Anthony Hajjar, and he too loved and adored Sudan. It was that experience that made me really conclude that this is where I want to be. But I knew that I was going to need to leave, become a slightly polished version of myself, and then return and have more to offer. So that's what I did. I left in 2018. The Sudanese revolution succeeded in 2019, and then I returned in 2020. So that was my peace restored. I started working in women, peace, and security in the conflict-affected states of South Darfur and South Kordofan, and I worked with super grassroots women leaders. They were incredibly strong and resilient women, and they knew exactly what they and their communities had to gain from peace. But they also knew that peace was not just an objective, it was an outcome, and they knew exactly what they needed to do to get there. They had dreams, they had hopes, and most profoundly, they had will at all times across all of Sudan's different turmoil and political instability. So at the same time, in a nearby village called Abu Jubeha in South Kordofan, one historically also plagued by conflict, a cotton processing factory was operating. And when speaking to someone from that company, they told me that their workers come in from different villages composed of different ethnic tribes, arrive at the warehouse, leave their weapons, see to their shifts, finish their shifts, pick their weapons back up, and go home. For me, living and breathing peace outcomes, this was a very clear indicator of social cohesion, something that we try so hard in my line of work to achieve. And here we had the private sector unknowingly and unintentionally doing that. They were providing socioeconomic opportunity to conflict-affected communities. They were even supporting in the rehabilitation of ex-combatants. And at the same time, they were bringing in communities from different ethnic backgrounds who may have had historical tensions. I was really taken aback by this unintended positive impact, and I really just felt impressed. And it really made me think, what could be if these efforts were more intentional and more wide scale? This was a really clear-cut example of peace finance, working in effect, and it was happening unintentionally. It was a golden case of a peace-positive investment. The private sector was generating profit, but it was having an extreme positive output for conflict-affected communities. This was 2 weeks before the war broke out in Sudan in April 2023. One moment, I was planning which filling to have for my date of the day for Ramadan, and the next moment, my sister, cousin, and I were planning our escape to safety away from explosions and crossfire. At this point, I really was not scared. I was in disbelief, I was confused, but there was a nagging feeling during that time that my dreams that had materialized were slipping away. The next moment, we had paramilitaries at our door. The next moment, we were on a bus to Egypt. And the next moment, Sudan was no more for me. Despair, hopelessness, rock bottom, my teenage dreams materialized and vanished just as quickly. I really grappled with grieving the loss of my country as it was, while also feeling overwhelmingly privileged and grateful to be alive and to have choice. Working in peace and conflict, I often had to speak of Sudan in a way that was detached from my emotions and my reality. It was really a classic case of heartbreak. Day in, day out, I would work in peace and conflict, but at the same time, I knew that peace was completely stripped from my homeland. It was really hard to maintain hope and optimism. Not only did my efforts feel futile, but I felt naive. But over the past year, my hopes and perceptions of peace have changed. Conflict zones are not dead zones. People still work, they still live, they still innovate, and they thrive with what they can, for often they feel like they have no choice. When you hear of conflict, you usually think it's this faraway phenomena that affects, 9 million people in country X. But these 9 million people too likely adored their country. They created small joys, small routines. They liked having their tea outdoors. They liked dusting off their entryways in the morning, and they enjoyed their strolls back from the mosque after fajr prayer. Peace is really to be embraced by what you value. Peace is not black and white. It's not just an objective, it's an outcome. And it's in our mindset, it's in our politics, it's in our business, and it's in how we engage with one another as humans. Peace is to be valued and to have choice. So as this talk started, I plot and fantasize about the day I can return to Sudan once again, back to my home in Khartoum. Perhaps this time visiting my father's hometown, Imruwaba, in North Kordofan, for the first time, as I had planned to do so that same year of the war. And returning to my mother's neighborhood in Durman, Al-Rikabiya. Hopefully a better, more compassionate human with more grit and love than I had before, like those still in Sudan today. Thank you.